The books that I read when I started studying for the ministry, especially when I was dealing with Old Testament history and anthropology and so on, very often spoke about the cradle of civilization. And as you worked through the book, you would see that the cradle of civilization that was referred to was the access of Egypt and Greece and Persia, or Parthia as it was called way back when, and God's little afterthought, the Roman Empire, that never had an original thought in its head, but should have had as its emblem not the eagle but the raccoon, because it was always scrabbling around in the trash cans of other cultures and bringing stuff home and somehow making it work. These writers of these books had obviously never heard of the cultures of China, 5,000 years older by the very least, of the cultures of South America and Central America, the Incas and the Aztecs. Never heard of the Benin culture of West Africa that controlled an area. If you were to take the big pond out of the middle of Rome's territory, the Mediterranean, the land mass of the Roman Empire was smaller than the territory controlled by the Benin culture of West Africa. Later on, the books began to change, and they started talking, they slipped the word Western in there. You were talking about the cradle of Western civilization, still talking about Arabia and Greece and Egypt and Persia, and India was beginning to come into the picture then as well. But you had these enormous circles and arcs of culture and influence and trade and armies that for a while, shorter or longer, would touch each other and then move apart and leave a high water mark of something of their culture, something in the language, something of the culture. They would leave a god behind or something like that. And within one of these cultures was this little group called the Semitic culture, which included the Phoenicians, the Philistines, some of the Assyrians and so on, the Moabites, and this tiny, scruffy little bunch called the Hebrews. And when you read the Hebrew scriptures and when you get in touch with their story, you have to find a place for it within all these bigger stories of the empires. And within this Hebrew culture, there's another little group which became known by scholars as the Judeo-Christians. That within this culture, there was a group who believed that God finally kept God's promise and had sent the Messiah. And that the Messiah was the one that they themselves had been waiting for. And within this group, there were no scriptures yet. Oh, they read the Hebrew scriptures. They checked what Jesus said about himself against what the prophecies had said about the coming Messiah. But the only scripture as such that this new subculture had to go on were the stories that Jesus told himself, and taking note of the actions that Jesus perpetrated himself. And within this 33-year life, there was a 3-year ministry. And within this 33-year ministry, there was this interruption when Jesus had come from across the lake, outside of his own culture, and had dealt, you remember, with the Gadarene swine, where he healed somebody, and the demons went into the swineherd, and the swineherd thundered into the sea and totally upset the economics of the area for quite a while. Jesus comes back to home territory, and the first thing he meets is a Pharisee, the leader of the synagogue, an important man in the culture. And he promises to go along with him to go and deal with this problem that this man has, namely a very, very sick young child. Within that, you will also remember there is this other story of a woman who doesn't have the cachet of a rich daddy that can bail her out, a caring parent that will go and find some means, any means, of making sure that she lives, loading the dice in her favor with all his clout, financial and status-wise. This woman has nothing. You've heard the menu of her sins. She was a woman. She was a widow. As such, she was a beggar probably. And she was ritually unclean because of a continual hemorrhage. While she was bleeding, she could not attend the services and the sacrifices. She was excluded even from the presence of God. And out of the interested crowd around Jesus, a probably very dirty, unmanicured hand reaches out and grabs his cloak, and he heals her through this touch. I wonder if you remember in the telling of that little background story how Jesus refers to her just before the verse that Cheryl started reading. It says this: he looked around and to see who had touched him. The woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, no gladness, no celebration for her healing, in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, I have the same relationship with you. I have the same care. I have the same overwhelming concern for you. And I am prepared to use as much of my clout for you as Jairus is using for this little girl that he calls daughter." Now, Jairus and his little girl, the one with a cute little nickname, the Bible translates it as little girl, but it is actually the name of a little antelope, an infant antelope, which is why I used the word dandy for the children, is one of the stories within a story. This unknown woman, no name, no nickname. It was far more important for her to hear of her status. Daughter is a circle within a circle. I want you to suspend every image that you have in your mind of Jesus coming into this house. Because he was a rich man, it was probably not the normal one room, probably 10 foot by 10 foot, and a ceiling very often no higher than 7 foot, because beyond that was luxury. It was building material that could be used elsewhere. And a full-grown man could very seldom stand upright in his own house.